Some mistakes follow you no matter how far you run. Some wounds never truly heal, no matter how many years pass in silence. Lenore Dax left everything behind 20 years ago and disappeared into the Bitterroot Mountains with her German shepherd, Brigg. She built a life in the wilderness, far from the son she abandoned and the tragedy she caused. But when Brigg discovers a strange growth on an old pine tree, Lenore finds something inside that shouldn't exist. Something impossible. Something that seems to know exactly who she is and what she's done. What could the forest be trying to tell her after all these years of hiding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Lenore Dax turned 63, she woke to find fresh snow covering the porch of her cabin, and Brigg already awake, watching her from his spot near the wood stove. No cake, no candles, no phone calls from anyone who remembered or cared. Just another day in the Bitterroot Mountains, where she'd spent the last 2 decades learning to live with silence. She rose from her cot and added wood to the stove, her joints protesting the cold. The cabin was small, 1 room with a sleeping area, a kitchen corner, and space enough for a table she'd built herself from lodgepole pine. No electricity, no running water except what she hauled from the creek a 1/4 mile down the slope. The outhouse stood another 50 yards into the trees, a constant reminder that comfort was something she'd surrendered long ago. Brigg stretched and padded over, pressing his grey muzzle against her leg. He was getting old too. She'd found him as a pup 10 years back, half-starved and limping through the forest with a bullet wound in his shoulder. Someone's failed hunting dog, most likely. They'd healed together, learned to trust each other in the way that only the abandoned can. "Morning, old man," she said, scratching behind his ears. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, wool pants, 2 flannel shirts, and a down vest that had seen better decades. Her boots were resoled twice over, held together now more by duct tape and stubbornness than the original leather. She caught her reflection in the small mirror by the door and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back had weathered skin, grey hair she kept short with sewing scissors, and eyes that had forgotten how to soften. 20 years ago, she'd been Dr. Lenore Dax, field biologist with the Forest Service, specializing in ecosystem dynamics and forest health. She'd published papers, presented at conferences, taught graduate seminars about the intricate relationships between soil composition and tree growth. She'd been good at her work, respected. She'd had a life that made sense. Then she'd destroyed it all in a single afternoon. Lenore pushed the thought away, the way she did every morning. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside with Brigg at her heels. The snow was pristine, unmarked except by the tracks of a fox that had passed in the night. The air bit at her lungs, sharp and clean in a way that city air never was. Above, the sky showed that particular blue that only came with high altitude and late autumn. Her cabin sat on a small plateau, roughly 8 miles from the nearest trail, 15 from the nearest road. She'd chosen the location deliberately, studying topographic maps until she found a spot remote enough that no one would stumble across her by accident. The first 2 years, she'd lived in a tent while building the cabin by hand, hauling materials piece by piece from an abandoned logging site 6 miles south. The work had nearly killed her. She'd lost 30 pounds that first year, suffered through a winter that dropped to 20 below, and broken 3 fingers when a log rolled wrong. But she'd finished it. Built herself a prison. Built herself a home. She checked her traps first, 3 snares set along rabbit runs and a deadfall for larger game. 2 rabbits this morning, which meant protein for the week. She reset the traps with practiced efficiency, then moved on to check the cache where she stored dried meat and foraged foods away from bears. Everything secure, everything in order. Brigg ranged ahead, nose to the ground, doing his own morning patrol. He knew this forest as well as she did now, every game trail and water source within a 5-mile radius. He'd saved her life twice, once from a mountain lion that got too curious, once from her own despair during a winter when the isolation had nearly broken her completely. She'd almost given up that year, almost walked out into a blizzard and let the cold take her. But Brigg had refused to let her leave the cabin, placing himself between her and the door, growling whenever she reached for her coat. He'd kept her alive until spring came, and with it, a reason to keep going. Not a good reason. Just a reason. Back at the cabin, she skinned and cleaned the rabbits, her knife moving with the automatic precision of 20 years' practice. She'd been a vegetarian before coming here. That hadn't lasted long. Survival had a way of simplifying philosophy. The inside of her cabin was sparse but organized. Shelves held her few possessions, 3 books she'd read so many times the pages were loose, a deck of cards for solitaire, her old field journal from her biology days, though she hadn't opened it in years. Medical supplies in a tin box, sewing kit, fire-starting equipment, a hand-crank radio that sometimes picked up a station from Missoula, though she rarely bothered anymore. On the highest shelf, in a wooden box she'd carved herself, was a photograph. She hadn't looked at it in months, but she knew every detail by heart. A young woman with long dark hair and laugh lines, just starting around her eyes, kneeling beside a boy of maybe 7 or 8. The boy had her same dark hair, her same sharp chin. He was holding up a pine cone like a trophy, grinning at something beyond the camera's frame. Colin. His name was Colin. The photograph was from a camping trip they'd taken into these very mountains. Back when she'd still been trying to balance career and motherhood, back when she'd believed she could have both. She'd brought him here to teach him about the forest, to share her love of the wild places. She'd wanted him to understand why she did what she did, why sometimes she had to be gone for weeks at a time, why her work mattered. Instead, she'd taught him that she couldn't be trusted to keep him safe. Lenore set the rabbits aside and forced herself to focus on the present. She had work to do. The root cellar needed reinforcing before the deep freeze, firewood to split, water to haul. The endless tasks of survival that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering too far into the past. She spent the afternoon splitting wood, her maul rising and falling in a rhythm she could maintain for hours. Brigg dozed in a patch of sunlight, twitching through dreams of chasing things. The physical labor felt good, honest in a way that thinking never was. Her muscles burned, her hands blistered despite the calluses. She welcomed the pain. By evening, she had enough wood stacked to last another week. She washed in the creek, the water so cold it made her gasp, then returned to the cabin to cook one of the rabbits over the wood stove. She saved the other for Brigg, who ate with the focused intensity of a dog who remembered hunger. After dinner, she sat at her small table and tried to read by lamplight. The book was one she'd salvaged from an old cabin she'd found years ago. A Western novel with a cracked spine and water-damaged pages. She'd read it a dozen times, but it didn't matter. The words were just something to occupy her eyes while her mind wandered its usual paths. 20 years. 2 decades of deliberate isolation. Some days she wondered if she'd ever really existed before this, or if Dr. Lenore Dax had been someone else, entirely. a character in a story she'd once heard. She'd left behind more than her son and her career. She'd left behind the person she'd been, buried her old self so deep that sometimes she couldn't remember what it felt like to laugh, to hope, to believe in anything beyond the next sunrise. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines. Brigg raised his head, ears forward, listening to something she couldn't hear. Then he settled again, satisfied that whatever he'd detected posed no threat. Lenore closed the book and prepared for bed. She banked the fire, checked that the door was latched, laid out her clothes for morning. The rituals of someone who'd learned that routine was the only thing standing between survival and surrender. She climbed into her cot and pulled the sleeping bag close. Brigg moved to his usual spot beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. In the darkness, listening to the wind and the settling of the cabin's timbers, she let herself think what she tried not to think during daylight hours. Colin would be 28 now. A man. Living a life she knew nothing about, with people she'd never meet. Did he think of her? Did he hate her? Had he forgiven her for leaving? Or had he learned to forget she'd ever existed? She'd written him letters over the years, dozens of them, but never sent a single one. They were in a box beneath her cot, yellowed and creased from being folded and unfolded, read and reread. Apologies that would never be delivered. Explanations that would never be heard. Love that would never be received. The worst part wasn't the guilt, though that was considerable. The worst part was knowing she deserved every moment of this isolation. She'd made her choice. She'd walked away from an 8-year-old boy who needed his mother because she couldn't face what she'd done, couldn't bear to see the fear in his eyes when he looked at her. So she'd run, and she'd kept running until there was nowhere left to go. Brigg sighed in his sleep, his paw twitching. Somewhere outside, an owl called. The wind eased, and the night settled into the particular stillness that came with deep cold. Lenore closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing she'd wake before dawn, knowing she'd face another day of surviving in this place she'd chosen. This beautiful, terrible place where she'd buried herself alive. The forest had taken her in 20 years ago, given her shelter and solitude. It had asked nothing in return, except that she respect its rules, understand its rhythms. She'd become part of it, as much as any tree or stone. She'd thought that would be enough. She'd thought eventually the past would fade, that time and distance would heal what guilt and shame had broken. But some wounds, she was learning, go deeper than time can reach. Some mistakes echo longer than a lifetime, and some truths, no matter how deeply buried, eventually find their way back to the surface. Tomorrow, she would wake and begin again. Tomorrow, she would survive another day. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow everything would change. Brigg woke her an hour before dawn, whining low in his throat. Not his usual wake-up routine. This was different, urgent, insistent. Lenore came fully awake, her hand already reaching for the hunting knife she kept beside her cot. "What is it, boy?" He moved to the door and back, his nails clicking on the plank floor. His whole body was tense, focused on something outside. Not a predator. She knew his bear alert, his mountain lion warning. This was something else. She dressed quickly and followed him out into the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature had dropped overnight, and her breath came in white plumes. Above, stars blazed with the intensity that only came with cold air and high altitude. Brigg immediately headed east, moving fast along a game trail she knew led deeper into the forest. "Brigg, wait." But he didn't wait. He broke into a trot, looking back only once to make sure she was following. She grabbed her flashlight and hurried after him, her boots crunching through frozen snow. Whatever he'd found, it had him more worked up than she'd seen in years. They moved deeper into the trees, following a route that took them past familiar landmarks, the lightning-struck cedar, the granite outcropping that looked like a bear's head, the seasonal creek that ran dry in summer. Brigg never slowed, never hesitated. He knew exactly where he was going. After 20 minutes of steady hiking, he stopped abruptly at the base of an enormous ponderosa pine. The tree was ancient, easily 300 years old, its trunk thick enough that 3 people couldn't circle it with linked arms. Brigg stood rigid, staring up at something Lenore couldn't yet see, and began to bark. "Easy," she said, moving beside him. "What are you—" She saw it then, and her words died in her throat. About 8 feet up the trunk, there was a growth. Not a burl or a canker, nothing she'd seen in all her years studying forest biology. This was different. Massive, easily the size of a large watermelon, and utterly wrong. The growth pulsed. She stood perfectly still, watching. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a rhythmic expansion and contraction, like something breathing, like something alive. Her scientific training kicked in, overriding her initial shock. She moved closer, shining her flashlight directly on the anomaly. The surface was smooth, almost translucent, with a texture that reminded her of tree sap but seemed more organic somehow, fleshy. Veins, or something like veins, ran through it in dark thread-like patterns. "That's not possible," she whispered. Trees didn't grow things like this. Parasites, fungi, insect galleries. She knew all of those. This was none of them. This was something that violated every principle of plant biology she'd ever learned. Brigg whined again, his eyes fixed on the growth. She reached up, hesitated, then carefully touched the surface with one gloved finger. It was warm. Warmer than it should be in this cold, and as she pressed slightly, she felt resistance, like touching living tissue rather than wood. She pulled back, her heart hammering. Every instinct told her to leave, to walk away from this impossible thing and pretend she'd never seen it. But her curiosity, the same curiosity that had driven her into field biology decades ago, wouldn't let her. She pulled her knife from its sheath. If this was some kind of disease, some new pathogen affecting the forest, she needed to understand it. She needed to see what was inside. The blade cut into the growth more easily than she expected. The outer membrane parted, and a clear fluid began to seep out, running down the bark in thick rivulets. The smell hit her immediately, organic but not rotten, sweet and wrong in equal measure. She widened the incision carefully, creating a window into whatever this thing was. Her flashlight beam penetrated the opening, and for a moment she couldn't process what she was seeing. Inside the growth, suspended in that clear fluid, was something that looked like human tissue. Not degraded or decomposed, fresh, pink and perfect and utterly impossible. It looked like a child's hand. Lenore staggered backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. Her mind reeled, trying to find an explanation that made sense. A medical waste dump? No, they were miles from any road. An animal? Wrong structure, wrong proportions. She forced herself to look again, to really examine what she was seeing. 5 fingers, an opposable thumb, the size and shape consistent with a human child, maybe 8 or 9 years old. The tissue showed no signs of decay, no discoloration. It looked like it had been preserved moments after. After what? Her stomach twisted. She turned away, fighting the urge to vomit. Brigg pressed against her leg, his usual stoic demeanor cracking into something like distress. He knew something was terribly wrong. "It's okay," she told him, her voice shaking. It's okay. But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. She forced herself to think clearly. Option 1. This was some kind of hoax, though who would create such a thing miles into the wilderness made no sense. Option 2. There was a body somewhere nearby, and this was... what? Some bizarre natural process of preservation she'd never encountered. Option 3. She was losing her mind. 20 years of isolation finally catching up with her, creating hallucinations vivid enough to fool her. She looked at the growth again. Still there. Still pulsing. Still impossibly real. Her hands trembled as she cut a small sample from the edge of the opening, a piece small enough to fit in her collection bag. Even separated from the main mass, the tissue continued to show that strange rhythmic movement, as if it had its own heartbeat. The sky was beginning to lighten, dawn spreading grey light through the trees. In the growing visibility, she could see the ponderosa pine more clearly. The bark around the growth showed stress patterns, abnormal ridges and splits that suggested the tree itself was reacting to whatever this thing was. She stepped back, trying to take in the full picture. How long had this been here? Days? Weeks? The growth was large enough that it must have taken considerable time to develop, yet she passed through this area regularly and had never noticed it before, unless it had appeared recently, unless whatever process had created this was still active. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Brigg nudged her hand, then looked back the way they'd come. He wanted to leave. So did she. But as she turned to go, something caught her eye. Another tree, maybe 30 yards away. She could just make out something on its trunk, a darkness that might be shadow or might be... "No," she said aloud. "Not another one." But she had to know. She crossed the distance with Brigg, reluctant, at her heels. And there it was. Another growth, smaller than the first, but showing the same impossible characteristics. Pulsing. Warm. Alive in a way that trees should not be alive. She didn't cut this one open. She'd seen enough. More than enough. The walk back to her cabin took half the time as her trek out. She moved fast, her mind racing faster. 20 years she'd lived in these mountains. 20 years of watching the forest, understanding its patterns, seeing how life and death played out in the endless cycle of growth and decay. This was something new. Something wrong. Something that shouldn't exist. And the worst part, the part that made her hands shake as she climbed the steps to her porch, was that the hand inside that growth had looked familiar. Not in any way she could articulate or explain, but familiar nonetheless. Like something she'd seen before. Like something from a memory she'd been trying to forget for 20 years. Inside the cabin, she placed the tissue sample under her old microscope, a field model she'd kept from her biology days. Under magnification, the cells looked even more impossible. Plant and animal tissue merged in ways that defied every law of biology. Chloroplasts sat alongside what looked like muscle fibers. Cell walls that shouldn't exist shared space with cellular structures that couldn't survive outside a mammalian body. She sat back, her hands covering her mouth. In all her years of training, all her research, she'd never seen anything remotely like this. The forest had given her shelter for 20 years. It had been her refuge, her sanctuary, the place where she'd hidden from the world and from herself. Now it was showing her something, revealing something, and she had absolutely no idea what it meant or what she was supposed to do about it. But one thing was certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Those growths were too deliberate, too purposeful. They meant something. And somehow, impossibly, she suspected they meant something specifically for her. Lenore didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table with the tissue sample, her field journal open for the first time in years, trying to sketch what she'd seen. Her hands wouldn't stay steady. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that small hand suspended in fluid, perfect, and impossible. Brigg watched her from his spot by the stove, his eyes tracking her movements with concern. He knew her moods, knew when something was wrong. And everything about this was wrong. By morning, she'd filled 3 pages with observations, diagrams, questions she had no way of answering. The scientific method demanded objectivity, repeatability, peer review. She had none of those things. Just herself, a microscope older than most college students, and a mystery that violated everything she knew about how life worked. The sample under the microscope had changed overnight. The cells were still alive, if that was even the right word, but they'd begun organizing themselves differently. The plant structures and animal structures were separating, as if trying to return to their original states, or as if whatever had bound them together was breaking down now that they were separated from the main growth. She made notes, her handwriting cramped and urgent. Temperature stable at approximately 98 degrees, despite ambient room temperature of 55 degrees. Cellular respiration evident in both plant and animal components. No signs of necrosis or decay. Sample continues rhythmic pulsing at approximately 60 beats per minute. 60 beats per minute. A human resting heart rate. She pushed away from the table and walked to the window. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Beautiful. Serene. Completely at odds with the turmoil in her mind. The logical part of her brain, the part trained in scientific inquiry, insisted there had to be an explanation. Some undocumented fungal infection, a previously unknown parasitic organism, something natural, however unusual, that followed the rules of biology even if she didn't yet understand them. But another part of her, deeper and more instinctive, knew better. This wasn't natural. This was something else, entirely. She thought about Colin. Couldn't help it. That hand had been the size of a child's hand. Colin had been 8 when she'd brought him to these mountains. 8 when everything had gone wrong. The memory came whether she wanted it or not, vivid despite the years she'd spent trying to bury it. They'd been hiking, and she'd stopped to examine a grove of aspens, showing signs of disease. She'd told Colin to stay on the trail, promised she'd only be a minute. But a minute had turned into 10, then 20. She'd gotten lost in her work, cataloguing symptoms, taking samples, completely absorbed in the puzzle before her. When she'd finally remembered her son, she'd turned to find him gone. The panic had been immediate and total. She'd called his name, crashing through the underbrush, her scientific calm shattered completely. She'd found him 15 minutes later at the base of a steep slope, crying and holding his arm at an odd angle. He'd wandered off the trail, gotten disoriented, tried to climb down a rocky outcropping. He'd fallen 12 feet onto loose scree. His arm had been broken, a clean fracture, the medics said later. He'd also had a concussion, bruised ribs, and enough emotional trauma that he'd barely spoken to her for weeks afterward. But he'd survived. He'd healed. She was the one who'd broken. Because in that moment, when she'd found him crying in the rocks, she'd seen the truth about herself. She'd chosen her work over her child's safety. She'd been so absorbed in dying trees that she'd forgotten about the living boy who needed her attention. What kind of mother did that? What kind of person? The guilt had. been crushing. Even after Colin's arm healed, even after he'd started talking to her again, she couldn't shake the weight of it. Every time she looked at him, she saw her failure. Every time she held him, she felt like a fraud. How could she claim to love him when she'd been willing to forget he existed for 20 minutes of research? So she'd left. Told herself it was for his own good, that he'd be safer with his father, that she couldn't be trusted. The truth was simpler and more painful. She'd left because she couldn't forgive herself, and she couldn't bear to see the fear in his eyes every time she told him to wait while she worked. She'd come to these mountains because they were familiar, but empty. Because she could live here without hurting anyone else. Because the isolation felt like the punishment she deserved. And now the forest was showing her a child's hand, preserved in an impossible growth on a tree she'd walked past 100 times. Lenore turned from the window and looked at Brigg. "I'm losing my mind, aren't I?" He tilted his head, considering. Then he stood and moved to the door, whining softly. He wanted to go back, wanted to show her something else. "No," she said. "Not yet. I need to think." But Brigg was insistent. He scratched at the door, looked at her, then scratched again. She'd learned to trust his instincts over the years. He'd kept her alive more than once by knowing things before she did. She grabbed her coat and followed him outside. This time he led her west, toward a part of the forest she rarely visited. The terrain was rougher here, full of deadfall and rocky outcroppings that made travel difficult. They hiked for almost an hour, climbing steadily, before Brigg stopped at a cluster of 3 Douglas firs growing so close together their roots must be intertwined. On the center tree, about head height, was another growth. Lenore approached slowly, already knowing what she'd find, but hoping desperately to be wrong. The growth was smaller than the first 2, maybe the size of a grapefruit. But it showed the same characteristics, that translucent surface, those dark veins, that impossible pulse. She cut into it carefully, creating a small window. Inside, suspended in fluid, was a piece of fabric. Blue denim, faded and worn. Part of a sleeve, maybe, or a pant leg. Her breath caught. She knew that fabric, had bought jeans just like that for Colin, back when 8-year-old boys destroyed clothes faster than she could replace them. "It's not possible," she whispered. She took a sample, both the fabric and some of the surrounding tissue, and placed them in a collection bag. Her hands moved mechanically, following protocols she'd learned decades ago, while her mind spun in circles trying to make sense of the impossible. The fabric was preserved perfectly. No decomposition, no fading beyond what it had shown 20 years ago. As if it had been frozen in time the moment it entered the growth. Lenore stepped back and looked, around. 3 trees, growing close together. She recognized this spot now. She and Colin had stopped here during their camping trip. He'd been fascinated by how the trees had grown together, had asked if they were friends. She'd explained root grafting, mycorrhizal networks, the way trees communicated and shared resources beneath the ground. She'd been in full teacher mode, excited to share her knowledge with her son. He'd been bored within 5 minutes. She'd kept talking anyway, unable to stop herself from lecturing, unable to just be a mother instead of a scientist. And now the forest was giving her back pieces of that trip, showing her things that should have been lost to time and decay. She pulled out her old topographic map, another relic from her biology days, and marked the locations of all 3 growths. They formed a rough triangle, each about a 1/4 mile from the others, and they were all in areas she and Colin had visited during that camping trip. A pattern was emerging. She didn't understand it yet, didn't want to believe what it might mean. But patterns were what scientists looked for. Patterns were how you moved from observation to theory. She made her way back to the cabin with Brigg ranging ahead, his job done for now. Her mind catalogued what she knew, 3 growths, all containing impossible hybrid tissue. 1 with human remains, a child's hand. 1 with preserved fabric. 3 locations that corresponded to her memories of a camping trip 20 years ago. Back at the cabin, she spread her map on the table and began marking every place she could remember visiting with Colin during that trip. The aspen grove where she'd been working when he wandered off, the creek where they'd filtered water, the ridge where they'd watched the sunset. If her theory was correct, and God, she hoped it wasn't, there would be more growths, 1 for each place where something significant had happened, 1 for each moment she'd failed to pay attention, 1 for each piece of evidence that she'd been a terrible mother. She looked at the map, at all the marks she'd made, and felt something close to despair. If she was right, there could be a dozen of these things scattered through the forest. Maybe more. And she was going to have to find them all. Because whatever was happening here, whatever impossible thing the forest was doing, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was meant for her. Over the next 3 days, Lenore found 4 more growths. Each one made the mystery deeper and more personal. Each one carved away another piece of the armor she'd built around her guilt. The 4th growth was at the creek where she and Colin had stopped to filter water. Inside, a child's sock, still showing the pattern of cartoon dinosaurs she remembered buying. The 5th was near the ridge trail. Inside, what looked like a fragment of tooth, small, white, perfectly preserved. She remembered Colin losing a baby tooth during the trip. How excited he'd been, until she'd told him the tooth fairy probably didn't visit the wilderness. The 6th was at the aspen grove. This one was different, larger, and when she cut into it, she found not an object, but tissue that looked like skin. A small patch, maybe 2 inches across, showing the distinctive pattern of a scrape or abrasion. Colin had scraped his knee at the aspen grove right before he wandered off. She remembered the blood, the way he'd tried not to cry because he wanted to be brave. She'd cleaned it with water from her canteen, told him he'd be fine, then immediately gone back to examining the diseased trees. Now here was that scrape, preserved in an impossible growth, still showing the bright red of fresh blood, despite 20 years having passed. She sat down hard on a fallen log, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't some strange natural phenomenon that happened to align with her memories. This was targeted, specific. The forest was collecting pieces of that camping trip, preserving them in these impossible growths. But why? And how? Brigg sat beside her, his head resting on her knee. She stroked his fur absently, staring at the growth without really seeing it. Her scientific training kept trying to find rational explanations, but rational didn't fit anymore. She'd passed beyond rational when she'd seen that firsthand. She pulled out her map again and marked the new locations. The pattern was becoming clearer. The growths formed a trail, the exact trail she and Colin had followed during their camping trip. Starting at the parking area 15 miles north, winding through various points of interest, ending at the spot where Colin had fallen. She hadn't reached that spot yet. Hadn't had the courage to go there. But she knew she'd have to eventually. If the pattern held, there would be a growth there. Maybe the largest one. Maybe the one that would finally explain what was happening. That night, she couldn't eat. The rabbit stew she'd made sat untouched while she pored over her notes, trying to find some thread of logic she could follow. The samples she'd collected showed the same impossible characteristics under the microscope. Hybrid tissue that shouldn't exist, cellular structures that violated every principle of biology, and all of it connected to Colin, to that trip, to her failure as a mother. She thought about the tooth. It was definitely human, definitely from a child. DNA testing could confirm if it was Colin's, but she had no access to that kind of equipment anymore. And even if she did, what would it prove? That somehow the forest had collected physical evidence of her son's presence here 20 years ago and preserved it in a way that defied death and decay. The implications were staggering. If the forest could do this, could somehow collect and preserve organic material in these growths, what else could it do? Was it conscious in some way? Aware? Did it have intent, or was this some automatic process triggered by, what? Trauma? Emotion? Guilt? She'd read about forests as superorganisms, the mycorrhizal networks that connected trees, allowing them to share resources and information. There were scientists who argued that forests had a kind of distributed intelligence, that they could remember things in the pattern of their growth and chemical signals. But this was different. This wasn't slow chemical communication between root systems. This was active preservation of specific moments, specific objects. This was the forest showing her something, telling her something. The question was, what? On the 4th day, she found the 7th growth. This one was different in a way that made her stomach clench. It was at the campsite where she and Colin had spent their last night before the accident. And inside the growth wasn't an object or tissue sample. It was a voice. She didn't understand how at first. The growth pulsed like all the others. But when she cut into it, instead of fluid and preserved matter, sound spilled out. A child's voice, high and clear, saying words she remembered with perfect clarity. "Mum, can we go home tomorrow? I don't feel good." Colin's voice. From 20 years ago, preserved somehow in this impossible growth, playing on repeat like a recording trapped in tree flesh. She stumbled backward, her hand over her mouth. That conversation had happened. She remembered it. Colin had been tired and homesick, ready to end the trip early. She'd told him they had one more day of research planned, that she'd promised to check several more sites before they could leave. She'd prioritized her work over his discomfort. Again. The voice continued, trapped in its loop. "Mum, can we go home tomorrow? I don't feel good." She turned and walked away fast, Brigg hurrying to keep up. She couldn't listen to that voice, couldn't bear to hear her son's plea and remember how she'd dismissed it, how she'd told him to be tough, to appreciate the experience, to understand that her work was important. Back at the cabin, she stood at her window and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The sky burned orange and red, beautiful and indifferent to her turmoil. She'd come here to escape her guilt, to hide from what she'd done. But the forest wasn't letting her hide anymore. It was showing her everything, every mistake, every moment of neglect, every time she'd chosen her career over her child. And it was doing so with a precision that suggested something far beyond natural processes. The forest knew. Somehow, impossibly, it knew what had happened here 20 years ago. It had been watching, listening, collecting evidence like a silent witness to her failures. She looked at her map one more time. There was one location left, the place where Colin had fallen, the place where everything had shattered. She'd been avoiding it, but she couldn't anymore. If she wanted answers, if she wanted to understand what the forest was trying to tell her, she had to go there. She had to face the worst moment of her life, preserved and waiting in an impossible growth on a tree she'd been too afraid to approach for 20 years. Tomorrow, she decided, Tomorrow she'd finish the trail. Tomorrow she'd find out what the forest had saved from the moment when she'd destroyed everything. That night she dreamed of Colin's voice calling for her, over and over, while she stood frozen in a forest of pulsing growths, unable to move, unable to answer, unable to do anything but listen to her son's need and feel the weight of her failure crushing down on her like winter snow on weak branches. When she woke, Brigg was pressed against her side, whining softly. She held on to him and tried to remember how to breathe. One more location. One more growth. Then maybe she'd understand. Then maybe the forest would let her go. Or maybe it would show her something so terrible that she'd finally get what she deserved. Proof that she'd never deserved to be a mother at all. Lenore didn't go to the accident site the next day, or the day after that. Instead, she hiked the 15 miles to the nearest ranger station, driven by a question she couldn't shake. Had this happened before? The journey took her 2 days, camping overnight in a lean-to she'd built years ago for exactly this purpose. Brigg stayed close, sensing her agitation. The November cold had deepened, and snow threatened in the grey clouds overhead. Winter was coming early this year. The ranger station sat at the end of a Forest Service road, a small cabin with a radio tower and a parking area that held 2 vehicles. She approached cautiously. She hadn't spoken to another human being in over a year, and the thought of conversation made her almost as nervous as the mystery she was investigating. A young ranger, couldn't be more than 30, looked up from his desk as she entered. His name tag read, Josh Palmer. He had the clean-cut look of someone who'd taken the job for love of the outdoors, rather than inability to do anything else. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Her voice came out rough from disuse. "I need to see your records, missing persons reports, going back 20 years or more." Palmer's expression shifted to professional concern. "Are you looking for someone specific? I can—" "Just the records," she said. "I'm researching." She paused, searching for a plausible lie. "Forest accidents. Patterns of where people get into trouble. For a book I'm writing." It was weak, but Palmer seemed to accept it. Or maybe he just saw a weathered woman who'd clearly been living rough and decided not to press. He directed her to a filing cabinet in the back room. "Anything before 2015 is in paper files. After that it's digital, but I can help you search if you tell me what you're looking for." "I'll start with paper," she said. He left her alone with decades of incident reports, search and rescue operations, and missing persons cases. She started with the year Colin's accident happened and worked backward. The first thing she noticed was how many people went missing in these mountains. Not vanished without a trace, though there were some of those, but temporarily lost, requiring search parties. Most were found within 48 hours. Some took longer. A few were never found at all. She made notes of the ones that matched her timeline and location. 3 cases stood out. In 2002, a 10-year-old named Michael Porter had disappeared during a family camping trip. His parents reported him missing after he wandered away from their campsite. A massive search ensued. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. They'd found him 4 days later, alive but barely conscious, 8 miles from where he'd disappeared. He couldn't explain where he'd been or how he'd survived. The medical reports showed dehydration and exposure, but also noted something unusual. Small wounds on his hands and arms that looked almost surgical. Clean edges, minimal bleeding, as if something had taken samples. The case was eventually closed as an unexplained survival. Michael Porter recovered fully and returned to his family in Missoula. The second case was from 1998. A 12-year-old girl named Sarah Yates had gone missing during a school field trip. She'd been found 3 days later, confused and unable to remember anything past the first day. She'd been in good physical condition despite the time elapsed, with no signs of trauma or exposure. The third case was from 1995. A 16-year-old named David Chen had disappeared while hiking alone. He was found 6 days later, nearly 20 miles from his last known location. He reported strange dreams, lost time, and a feeling that something had been watching him. The report noted that he'd been found near a grove of old-growth pines, showing unusual fungal growth patterns. Lenore sat back, her mind racing. 3 cases, all in this forest, all involving children or teenagers who'd been lost and then found in ways that didn't quite make sense. And in at least one case, unusual wounds. In another, strange plant growth. She searched further back, found 2 more cases from the 1980s with similar patterns, then 3 from the 1970s. The details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. Children disappearing and reappearing, gaps in memory, unusual physical findings, mentions of strange animal behavior or plant anomalies. "Find what you needed." She jumped. Palmer had returned, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He offered her one, and she took it automatically, her hands wrapping around the warmth. "These disappearances," she said. "The ones where kids were found alive after several days. Did anyone ever figure out what happened?" Palmer shrugged. "Before my time. But I've heard stories. Some of the old-timers think there's something about this forest that—" He paused, looking embarrassed. "Well, they say it protects kids sometimes. Keeps them safe when they should be dead from exposure." "Protects them how?" "Don't know. Like I said, just stories. Probably the kids found shelter, drank from streams, got lucky. But there's this legend the Salish people have about these mountains, that the forest remembers things, that it holds on to." He stopped, shaking his head. "Sorry, that's probably not useful for your book." "Tell me anyway." He leaned against the filing cabinet. "The story goes that the forest is old enough to have memory. That trauma, especially involving children, gets absorbed somehow. The trees hold on to it, try to fix it. It's supposed to be a protective thing, but the old stories also warn that the forest might show you things, make you face what you've done." Lenore's coffee went cold in her hands. "Show you things how?" "I don't know the details. It's all pretty vague. Something about the trees growing reminders, keeping pieces of the past." He laughed, self-conscious. "Like I said, just legends. The rational explanation is that this forest is dense enough and remote enough that lost kids can find natural shelter, and the search parties just get lucky." But Lenore was barely listening. The forest remembers. The trees hold on to trauma, growing reminders, keeping pieces of the past. That's exactly what the growths were. Pieces of the past, preserved and presented. The forest showing her what had happened, making her face what she'd done. She stood abruptly. "Thank you. I need to go." Palmer looked surprised. "You want to take those files? I can make copies." "No. Thank you. I have what I need." She left before he could ask more questions, Brigg falling into step beside her. The walk back to her cabin took another 2 days, but her mind was moving faster than her feet. The pattern made sense now. Children had been disappearing in this forest for decades, maybe centuries. Most were found. Most survived. But the forest, whatever intelligence or process governed it, was collecting something from them. Evidence, memory, pieces, and it was doing the same with her camping trip with Colin, collecting the moments, preserving them. But why show them to her now? Why wait 20 years? unless the forest had been waiting for her to be ready, to be isolated enough, broken enough, guilty enough that she'd finally pay attention, that she'd finally face what she'd been running from. She thought about Michael Porter, found alive with strange wounds. She thought about the voice trapped in that growth, Colin asking to go home. She thought about all the pieces the forest had collected from that trip, displayed like evidence in a trial where she was the only defendant. The forest was making her face her guilt, making her walk through every moment where she'd failed Colin, making her see, in preservation, perfect and terrible, exactly what kind of mother she'd been. And she still had one location left, the accident site, where Colin had fallen because she wasn't watching, where he'd lain hurt and crying while she searched. Frantically, her scientific detachment finally shattered by the reality of what her neglect could cause. That growth would be the largest, the most complete, the forest's final piece of evidence. She reached her cabin on the evening of the second day, exhausted and shaking from more than just the cold. Inside, she built up the fire and tried to eat, but couldn't. The files she'd seen, the patterns she'd recognized, Palmer's casual mention of legends, it all pointed to something she couldn't quite accept, but couldn't deny. The forest was conscious, or something in it was. Some distributed intelligence spread through roots and soil, old enough to have developed something like memory, something like judgment. And it had been watching her for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to show her exactly what she'd done. The night after returning from the ranger station, Lenore dreamed of roots, vast networks spreading beneath the forest floor, connecting every tree, every plant, creating a web of communication that spanned miles. In the dream, she could see thoughts moving through the network like electrical impulses. Not human thoughts exactly, but something older. Information. Memory. The accumulated experience of centuries compressed into chemical signals and electrical potential. She woke, gasping, Brigg's cold nose pressed against her face. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window. She sat up and tried to shake off the dream's intensity, but it clung to her like morning fog. She'd spent years studying mycorrhizal networks, knew the science behind how forests communicated. But the dream had shown her something beyond science. It had shown her consciousness, slow and vast and utterly inhuman, but conscious nonetheless. She got up and made coffee, her hands moving through the familiar routine while her mind worked through implications. If the forest was conscious, if it could collect and preserve memories, then what did it want? Why preserve these specific moments from her camping trip with Colin? The answer seemed obvious: to make her face her guilt, to force her to confront every moment where she'd failed her son. But was that punishment or something else? Palmer had mentioned protection. The legend said the forest tried to fix trauma, tried to keep children safe. What if the growths weren't accusation but offering? What if the forest was giving her back what she'd lost? Not just objects and tissue, but the moments themselves. The chance to revisit, to understand, maybe even to what? She said aloud. Undo it? That's not possible. But neither were growths containing preserved human tissue and voices trapped in tree flesh. Possible had stopped being a useful category. She spent the morning preparing for what she'd been avoiding. The hike to the accident site would take most of a day. She'd need to bring supplies, camping gear in case she decided to stay overnight. And she'd need to bring tools, her knife, collection, bags, her field journal to document whatever she found. Part of her wanted to bring the old radio, to have some connection to the human world before she walked into whatever the forest was going to show her. But the radio had been silent for months. And besides, what would she say if she managed to reach someone? That the forest was alive and had been collecting evidence of her bad parenting? She packed methodically. Food for 3 days, water purification tablets, her medical kit, rope, a tarp, fire-starting supplies, the sort of careful preparation that came from 20 years of solo survival in the wilderness. Brigg watched her pack, his tail wagging slightly. He knew they were going somewhere, and unlike Lenore, he seemed excited about it. "You don't understand what we're walking into, do you, boy?" He tilted his head, then went to the door and waited. Ready. Trusting. He'd follow her anywhere, even into mysteries that defied explanation. She almost envied him that certainty. Before leaving, she did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled the wooden box down from the high shelf and opened it. The photograph looked back at her. Young Lenore and young Colin, frozen in a moment of happiness she barely remembered feeling. Had she been happy then? Or had she already been too consumed by her work, too focused on her career to really be present? She traced Colin's face with one finger. He'd be 28 now. A man. Living a life she knew nothing about. Did he ever think of her? Did he hate her for leaving? Did he understand, even a little, why she'd gone? She placed the photograph in her jacket pocket, close to her heart. Then she shouldered her pack and headed out with Brigg into the cold morning. The route to the accident site took her past several of the growths she'd already documented. The one containing Colin's sock, the one with the tooth. She didn't stop at any of them, just noted their presence like landmarks on a map that led inevitably to the moment when everything had broken. The November forest was quiet around her. Most birds had migrated south. The mammals were preparing for winter, their activity subdued. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They stopped for lunch near a creek, she remembered. Colin had caught a small trout here, using a stick and some fishing line she'd packed. He'd been so proud, so excited. She'd taken a photograph, a different one from the picture in her pocket, but she'd ruined the moment by immediately launching into a lecture about the trout species, its life cycle, its role in the ecosystem. Colin had listened politely, the way 8-year-olds do when they're waiting for adults to stop talking. Then he'd asked if they could eat the fish for dinner. She'd said no, they needed to release it. It was too small. They had other food. His face had fallen. Such a small moment. Such a minor disappointment. But it was one of dozens, hundreds of moments where she'd chosen information over connection, teaching over presence, where she'd been so determined to share her knowledge that she'd forgotten to share herself. The memory sat heavy in her chest as she continued hiking. How many moments like that had there been? How many times had Colin tried to connect with her, only to get a lecture instead? How many times had he given up trying? By late afternoon, she reached the ridge. The accident site was just below, a steep slope of loose rock and scattered trees. She could see it clearly from here. The outcropping where Colin had tried to climb down, the scree field where he'd landed. And there, at the base of the outcropping, was the largest tree she'd ever seen. A ponderosa pine that must have been 400 years old, its trunk so massive it dwarfed everything around it. And on its trunk, clearly visible even from this distance, was a growth the size of a person. Lenore stood at the ridge's edge, looking down at what awaited her. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came short. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to go back to her cabin, to never know what the forest had preserved from the worst moment of her life. But she'd come too far, run too long, hidden too completely. If the forest had something to show her, she owed it to herself, and to Colin, to look. She started down the slope, picking her way carefully over the loose rock. Brigg followed, more sure-footed than she was. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, illuminating the massive growth in golden light. As she got closer, she could see it pulsing. Slower than the others. Deeper. Like a heartbeat measured in decades rather than seconds. She reached the base of the tree and stood before the growth, her head tilted back to take in its full size. It was shaped almost like a cocoon, wrapped around the tree trunk from ground level to about 8 feet high. The surface showed the same translucent quality as the others, but with more complexity. Layers visible within layers, like looking into deep water. Inside, she could see shapes, movement. Something being preserved here was much more than tissue samples or lost objects. Lenore reached out with a trembling hand and touched the surface. It was warm, warmer than any of the others had been, and as her palm made contact, she felt something like recognition, like the growth knew she was there, like it had been waiting for her. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered. The growth pulsed once, strong and deliberate. Then its surface began to change, becoming more transparent, and Lenore saw what the forest had been holding for 20 years. Inside the growth, preserved in perfect detail, was a scene. A moment. Colin, at 8 years old, lying in the scree with his broken arm, tears streaming down his face, calling for her. But he wasn't alone. The scene inside the growth was impossibly detailed. Colin lying in the rocks, his small face twisted with pain and fear. But surrounding him, barely visible at first, were shapes in the fluid, translucent forms that looked almost like hands, dozens of them, cradling him, supporting his broken arm, keeping his head stable. The forest had been there. It had been holding him. Lenore pressed closer, her breath fogging the growth surface. She'd thought she knew what had happened that day. She'd found Colin alone, crying, hurt. She'd assumed he'd been lying there terrified and solitary while she'd crashed through the forest searching for him. But he hadn't been alone. She cut into the growth carefully, creating a window large enough to see more clearly. The fluid inside was warmer than the others, almost body temperature. And as it drained away, the scene became even clearer. Not just visual, but somehow dimensional, as if she could step into the memory itself. She saw Colin's lips moving, forming words. Calling for her? Yes. But also saying something else. Talking to something. She leaned closer, trying to understand. And then the growth showed her more. The roots beneath Colin had risen from the soil, forming a cushion that kept him from sliding further down the scree. Small plants had grown around him, creating a windbreak. Even the angle of his body had been adjusted somehow, positioned to minimize the damage from his broken arm. The forest had been protecting him. Lenore stumbled backward, her mind reeling. All these years she'd blamed herself for leaving him alone, and hurt. All these years she'd carried the guilt of those 20 minutes when she'd been searching frantically, imagining him suffering in solitude. But the forest had been there, holding him, keeping him safe while she found her way back. She sat down hard on the ground, her legs unable to support her. This changed everything. The guilt she'd been carrying, the self-imposed exile, the 20 years of isolation, all built on a version of events that wasn't complete. Brigg pressed against her side, whining softly. She buried her face in his fur and tried to breathe through the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know you were keeping him safe." But why show her this now? Why wait 20 years to reveal that Colin hadn't been alone, hadn't been suffering as much as she'd imagined? She looked at the growth again, and as if responding to her question, it changed. The scene shifted, moving forward in time. She saw herself arriving, saw Colin's face light up with relief, saw herself gather him into her arms, checking his injuries with shaking hands, crying and apologizing over and over. And she saw something else, something she'd forgotten in the trauma and guilt that followed. Colin had been scared, yes. Hurt, yes. But when he'd looked at her, there had been love in his eyes, relief, trust. He hadn't blamed her. At 8 years old, hurt and frightened, he'd still trusted that his mother would come for him. And she had. The scene shifted again, showing the aftermath, the helicopter evacuation, Colin in the hospital, his arm in a cast, already healing, his father arriving. The conversations Lenore couldn't quite hear, but could see in the body language, recriminations, accusations, decisions being made. She saw herself leaving, walking away from the hospital, from her son, from her life. And in the growth's fluid representation, she could see what she'd been too consumed by guilt to recognize at the time. Colin reaching for her as she left, his small hand stretching toward her retreating back, his father holding him back, saying something that made Colin's face crumple with confusion and hurt. She'd thought she was leaving to protect him, thought her presence would only remind him of the accident, of her failure. But Colin hadn't wanted her to go. He'd wanted his mother to stay. The growth showed her more, scenes she hadn't witnessed, couldn't have known. Colin as a teenager, asking his father about her. Where had she gone? Why wouldn't she call? Didn't she love him anymore? The scenes progressed through years. Colin growing up, graduating high school, college, always with that same question in his eyes whenever her name came up. Why did she leave? Lenore was crying now, tears streaming down her face. She'd been so wrapped up in her own guilt, so certain that leaving was the right thing, that she'd never considered what her absence might do to him. She'd thought she was sparing him further damage. Instead, she'd created a wound that never healed, the wound of abandonment. The growth pulsed, and the scene changed one final time. Colin as an adult, sitting at a computer, searching for her, his fingers typing her name into search engines, looking at old photographs, trying to find any trace of where she might have gone. And then, finally, a more recent scene. Colin in a doctor's office, receiving news that made his face go pale. Papers with medical terms, neurodegenerative disease, limited treatment options, uncertain prognosis. His wife beside him, holding his hand. His expression shifting from shock to something like resolve. After the appointment, Colin at that same computer, writing something, a letter, addressed to the woman living alone in the Bitterroot Mountains. Lenore's hands shook as she watched. He'd been looking for her, even after 20 years, even while facing his own mortality. He'd been trying to find her. The growth surface began to fade, the scenes dimming. But before they disappeared completely, one final image. Colin's face, recent, lined with the early signs of illness, but still recognizably her son. His lips moving, forming words the growth somehow conveyed directly to her understanding. I forgive you, Mum. I just want you to come home. The surface went opaque again, and Lenore was left kneeling in the scree, sobbing into her hands. 20 years. 20 years of hiding from guilt that Colin had never asked her to carry. 20 years of running from a son who'd been waiting for her to come back. She'd been so wrong. About everything. The accident hadn't destroyed their relationship. Her leaving had. Colin's fear hadn't been of her, but for her. Worry about why his mother would abandon him. and now he was sick, possibly dying, and still trying to find her. Brigg nudged her hand, then looked toward the massive growth. She followed his gaze and saw something she'd missed before. At the base of the growth, partially hidden by roots, was something that didn't belong to the past. She crawled forward and pulled it free. A plastic bag, weatherproof and recent, protected from the elements. Inside was a letter, the paper clean and white, dated 6 months ago, and an address in Missoula. Her hands trembled as she opened the letter. Colin's handwriting. She recognized it from the cards he'd made her when he was small. The message was short. To whoever finds this, I'm looking for my mother, Dr. Lenore Dax. She disappeared into these mountains 20 years ago. I've left copies of this letter at every ranger station and trailhead in the Bitterroot Range. If you know where she is, please tell her I'm not angry. Tell her I understand why she left, even if she doesn't. Tell her I'm sick, and I don't have much time. And more than anything, I just want to see her again. Tell her I forgive her. I always have. Colin Dax, Missoula, Montana. Below was an address and a phone number. Lenore clutched the letter to her chest, rocking back and forth in the rocks where her son had once lain hurt and calling for her. The forest had been showing her all along, not her failures, not her guilt, but the truth she'd been too afraid to see. Colin had never stopped loving her. The forest had protected him then, and now it was trying to protect him again, by bringing her back, by forcing her to face not her guilt, but her son's forgiveness. She looked up at the massive growth, at the tree that had held this truth for however long Colin had been searching. The forest remembered. It had held Colin safe 20 years ago. And now it was holding his forgiveness, his love, his desperate need to reconnect before time ran out. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for keeping him safe. Thank you for showing me. The growth pulsed once more, a slow, deep pulse that felt like acknowledgement, like release. The forest had delivered its message. Now it was up to her to act on it. She stood on shaking legs, the letter still clutched in her hand. Brigg pressed against her, solid and warm and real. The afternoon sun was starting to fade, but there was enough light left. Enough time. She could reach the ranger station in 2 days. From there, she could call the number on the letter. She could go to the address in Missoula. She could go home. After 20 years of running, she could finally go home. Lenore didn't sleep that night. She made camp near the massive growth, unable to leave it yet, unable to fully process what the forest had shown her. Brigg curled beside her while she sat by a small fire, Colin's letter in her hands, reading it over and over until she'd memorized every word. I forgive you. I always have. How many times had she imagined a reunion with Colin? Hundreds, maybe thousands. In every version he'd been angry. Rightfully so. She'd rehearsed apologies, explanations, justifications for why she'd left. She'd prepared herself for his rage, his rejection, his perfectly justified refusal to ever speak to her again. But she'd never prepared for forgiveness. The concept felt foreign, impossible. She'd spent 20 years building a prison of guilt, and now someone was offering her the key. But could she take it? Did she deserve it? She thought about the scenes the growth had shown her. Colin searching for her. Colin at the doctor's office. Colin writing that letter with the knowledge that his time was running out. He was sick. How sick? The letter said he didn't have much time. That could mean months, weeks, days. Panic clawed at her chest. What if she was too late? What if she'd wasted so much time hiding in these mountains that Colin would be gone before she reached him? She stood abruptly, startling Brigg awake. We need to go. Now. But reason asserted itself. It was full dark, the temperature dropping fast. Hiking at night through this terrain would be suicide. She'd break an ankle in the first mile, and then she'd never reach Colin. She forced herself to sit back down, to breathe, to think. The ranger station was 2 days away on foot, but there was a logging road, closer, maybe 8 miles north. If she could reach that, she might be able to flag down a vehicle. The road saw occasional traffic, Forest Service trucks, and the rare hunter with backcountry permits. 8 miles. She could do that by dawn if she pushed hard. Brigg could keep up. They'd travelled faster than that before. She looked at the growth one more time. In the firelight, it seemed to pulse with deeper meaning, as if it approved of her decision. As if this was what it had been waiting for all along. Her choosing to leave, to face her past, to step back into the world she'd abandoned. "I'm going to see him," she told the tree, feeling foolish but needing to say it aloud. "I'm going to tell him I'm sorry. I'm going to—" Her voice broke. "I'm going to be there. However much time he has left, I'm going to be there." The growth pulsed once, strong and certain. Then something remarkable happened. The surface began to open, peeling back like a flower blooming in fast motion. The fluid inside drained away into the ground, absorbed by the roots. And from the center of the growth, something emerged. A seed, perfect and whole, glowing faintly with its own light. It was the size of her fist, impossibly smooth and warm when she reached out to take it. The moment her fingers closed around it, she felt something. A rush of understanding that wasn't quite words or images, but pure meaning. The forest's final gift. Its blessing. Plant this seed where new life begins, where forgiveness takes root. She tucked the seed carefully into her pack, wrapping it in one of her spare shirts for protection. Then she kicked out her fire, shouldered her gear, and started hiking by the light of her headlamp. The night forest was treacherous, full of roots and hidden hollows, but she moved with the confidence of someone who'd lived here 20 years, someone who knew every trail and creek, every stand of trees and rocky outcrop. Brigg ranged ahead, his white coat visible in the darkness, guiding her when her headlamp wasn't enough. They hiked through the night, stopping only once to rest and drink water. Her legs ached, her lungs burned in the cold air. But she pushed through the pain, driven by urgency and something else, hope. After 20 years of hopelessness, the emotion felt strange and fragile, like something that might shatter if she examined it too closely. Dawn found them at the logging road. It was empty, a dirt track that wound through clear cuts and replanted sections, but it was maintained and passable. Lenore sat on a fallen log at the roadside, Brigg panting beside her, and waited. 2 hours passed. The sun rose higher, warming the air slightly. She used the time to clean up as best she could, combing her short hair with her fingers, brushing dirt from her clothes. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd been living off-grid for 2 decades. But she couldn't do anything about that now. Finally, she heard an engine. A Forest Service truck appeared around the bend, moving slowly on the rough road. She stood and flagged it down, her heart hammering. The driver was a woman in her 50s, with grey hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent her career outdoors. Her name tag read, Maria Vance. She looked at Lenore with curiosity, but no alarm. "You okay? Need help?" "I need a ride to the nearest town with a phone," Lenore said. "Please, it's an emergency." Vance's expression shifted to concern. "You hurt? Lost?" "No, but I need to call my son. I need to get to Missoula. It's complicated, but please, I'll explain on the way." Something in Lenore's voice must have convinced her. Vance nodded and gestured to the passenger seat. "Get in. I'm headed back to the station anyway. We've got phones there." Brigg jumped into the truck bed without prompting, and Lenore climbed into the cab. The seat felt strange after years of sitting on logs and stone. The enclosed space made her feel claustrophobic, but she forced herself to breathe normally. As they drove, she gave Vance the simplified version. She'd been living off-grid for personal reasons, had lost touch with her family, recently learned her son was trying to find her. Vance asked few questions, seemed to understand that some stories were too complicated to tell in a 20-minute drive. At the ranger station, a different one from where she'd visited Palmer, Vance led her inside and pointed to a phone on the desk. "Take your time. I'll be outside if you need anything." Lenore stood looking at the phone for a long moment. She hadn't made a phone call in 20 years, hadn't heard her own voice through electronic transmission since before she'd left civilization entirely. Her hand shook as she picked up the receiver and dialed the number from Colin's letter. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" A woman's voice, young, cautious. "I—" Lenore's voice came out as a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm looking for Colin Dax. I'm his mother." Silence on the other end. Then, Oh my God, is this really? Hold on, please hold on." Muffled voices in the background. Someone calling Colin's name, footsteps. Then a different sound, someone picking up the phone. "Mum?" 20 years collapsed in an instant. His voice was deeper, a man's voice instead of a child's, but she knew it in her bones, in her blood, in every cell of her body. Colin. She was crying now, couldn't help it. "Colin, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I saw your letter and I'm ready to come home. If you'll let me. If it's not too late." "It's not too late." His voice was thick with emotion. "Mum, it's not too late." "Where are you? I'll come get you. I'll drive anywhere." "I'm at a ranger station in the Bitterroots. I can get to Missoula on my own, but I need— Colin, your letter said you were sick." "How sick? What's happening?" A pause. Then, quietly. "ALS. Early stage still, but progressing. I've got time, Mum. Enough time. Enough time to get to know you again. To understand. I'm coming." Lenore's voice was fierce. "I'm coming right now. Today. Give me the address." He gave it to her, his voice steadying as they talked logistics. She could hear his wife in the background, crying. She could hear the hope in Colin's voice, the same hope that was filling her chest and making it hard to breathe. They talked for 30 minutes. Basic things, surface things, where she'd been, how she'd survived, what he'd been doing, carefully avoiding the deeper conversations that would need to happen in person. But underlying every word was the same message. "I'm coming home. I'm not leaving again." When she finally hung up, Vance was waiting with a sympathetic expression. "Need a ride to Missoula?" "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering. My shift ends in an hour. I can drop you wherever you need to go." Lenore could have cried again from the simple kindness of it. Instead, she nodded. "Thank you. I need to go back to my cabin first. Get a few things. It's about 8 miles. "I know where you've been living," Vance said quietly. "We've known someone was out there for years. Left you alone because you weren't causing trouble, and everyone deserves their privacy. But yeah, I can take you there first." They drove back along the logging road, then hiked the final mile to Lenore's cabin. Everything looked different now. Smaller, more temporary. This place that had been her whole world for 20 years was suddenly just a small building in a vast forest. She gathered her few precious possessions, the photograph, her field journal, some clothes. She left most of the survival gear, let it stay for the next person who needed refuge in the wilderness. But she packed the seed the forest had given her, wrapping it carefully in layers of cloth. Before leaving, she stood in the doorway and looked at the single room that had been her home, her prison, her sanctuary. Part of her would always belong here. The forest had sheltered her when she'd needed sheltering. It had let her heal at her own pace, in her own way, and when the time was right, it had shown her the way back. "Thank you," she whispered to the cabin, to the forest, to the mountains that had held her for 2 decades. "Thank you for everything." Then she closed the door and walked away with Brigg at her heels, not looking back. The past was important, but it was done. What mattered now was the future, however long or short it might be, with her son. 3 hours later, Vance dropped her at an address in Missoula, a small house with a maple tree in the front yard. Lenore stood on the sidewalk, her pack at her feet, Brigg sitting alert beside her. The front door opened, and Colin stepped out. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Lenore saw herself in Colin's face, the same dark eyes, the same sharp chin, but also his father's broader build and gentler expression. He was thinner than she'd expected, his movements slightly stiff in a way that suggested the disease was already affecting his muscles, but he was alive. Here. Real. "Mum," he said again, as if testing the word. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him the way she should have 20 years ago. But her feet wouldn't move. 20 years of isolation had forgotten how to bridge the distance between herself and another human being. Colin solved the problem by crossing the yard himself, moving carefully but determinedly. When he reached her, he hesitated just a moment, then pulled her into a hug. Lenore broke. All the control she'd maintained, all the strength that had kept her surviving through 2 decades of solitude, shattered like ice in spring thaw. She sobbed into her son's shoulder while he held her, one hand gentle on her back, murmuring words she couldn't quite hear over her own crying. "It's okay," he kept saying. "It's okay, Mom. You're here now. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. She'd missed 20 years of his life, his graduation from high school, college, his wedding. She'd missed everything, and no amount of crying could give that back. When she finally got control of herself, she pulled back and looked at him through tears. "I'm so sorry. Colin, I'm so sorry." "I know," he said simply. "I know you are, and I forgive you. I've been trying to tell you that for years, but—" He smiled, sad but genuine. "You're really good at hiding." A woman appeared in the doorway, late 20s, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Colin's wife. She approached cautiously, and Lenore saw the protective concern in her expression. This woman loved Colin, wanted to shield him from anything that might hurt him, including his mother. "Mum, this is Rachel. Rachel, this is my mum." Rachel's expression softened slightly. "I've heard a lot about you." "I'm sure you have," Lenore said. "None of it good." "Some of it good," Rachel corrected gently. "Colin's told me about the camping trips, the way you taught him about the forest. He has good memories, too. It's not all—" She paused, searching for words. "It's not all abandonment and trauma," Lenore finished. "You can say it. That's what I did." "That's not what I was going to say," Rachel said firmly. "I was going to say it's not all one thing. People are complicated. Situations are complicated. And whatever happened 20 years ago, you're here now. That's what matters to Colin." Brigg, who'd been sitting patiently through the reunion, chose that moment to stand and approach Colin. He sniffed carefully, then wagged his tail once. Colin knelt slowly and held out his hand. "Hey there, what's your name?" "Brigg," Lenore said. "He's been with me 10 years. He's a good dog." "I can tell." Colin scratched behind Brigg's ears, and the dog leaned into the attention. "Does he come inside, or—" "He does now," Lenore said. "If that's okay." "Of course it's okay. Come on, both of you. You must be exhausted." They went inside, and Lenore tried not to stare at everything. Central heating, electric lights, a refrigerator humming in the kitchen, furniture that didn't have to be hand-built. It all felt surreal after 20 years of living with only what she could make or scavenge. Rachel made tea, actual tea, in actual ceramic mugs, and they sat in the living room. Lenore perched on the edge of the couch, still not quite able to relax into furniture that comfortable. Brigg settled at her feet, his presence a comfort in this strange, new old world. "So," Colin said, after a moment of awkward silence, 20 years in the mountains. That's pretty intense." Lenore laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That's one word for it. Were you alone the whole time?" "Except for Brigg. And before him, yes. Completely alone." Colin absorbed this, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Why? I know why you left originally," Dad explained. "Your guilt, your depression, how you thought you were protecting me. But why stay gone? Why not—" "Come back?" Lenore set down her mug with shaking hands. "Because I was a coward. Because I convinced myself you were better off without me. Because every year that passed made it harder to imagine coming back until it seemed impossible." "But you did come back," Rachel said quietly. "When it mattered most, you came back." "I almost didn't," Lenore admitted. "If Colin hadn't left that letter, if the forest hadn't—" She stopped, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. "If the forest hadn't what?" Colin leaned forward, genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Lenore took a deep breath. She'd promised herself no more hiding, no more half-truths. If she was going to be in Colin's life, however much life he had left, she owed him honesty. "If the forest hadn't shown me the truth," she said, "if it hadn't made me face what I'd been running from." She told them everything, about the growths, the preserved tissue, the voices and objects the forest had collected, about the pattern that followed her camping trip with Colin, the impossible biology she'd documented, the scenes the final growth had shown her, about the legends Palmer had mentioned, and the missing children who'd been found alive when they should have died. She expected skepticism, maybe concern about her mental state. Instead, Colin and Rachel listened with careful attention. When she finished, Colin sat back with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That explains some things," he said finally. "What things?" "After the accident, after my arm healed, I had dreams for years about the forest, about something holding me, keeping me safe. I thought it was just my child brain processing trauma, creating a comforting fantasy. But the dreams were so vivid. I could feel—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I could feel the roots under me. Feel something that wasn't quite hands but wasn't quite not hands, keeping me still so I wouldn't hurt myself worse." Lenore stared at him. "You never told anyone?" "I told Dad. He thought it was the concussion or wishful thinking. He told me I'd been alone until you found me, that I was probably just confused about the timeline." "You weren't confused," Lenore said. "The forest was there. It was holding you. I saw it in the growth, Colin. I saw you lying in those rocks, and the forest was cradling you like—" Her voice broke. "Like I should have been." "You did cradle me," Colin said firmly. "When you found me. I remember that part clearly. You were crying and saying you were sorry over and over, and you held me so carefully, like you were afraid I'd break. I remember feeling safe with you, Mum. Even hurt and scared, I felt safe because you were there. But then I left." "Yeah, you did." Colin's voice was gentle but honest. "And that hurt worse than the broken arm. But I'm starting to understand why. Not just the guilt Dad talked about, but you couldn't forgive yourself. And if you couldn't forgive yourself, you couldn't believe I'd forgiven you." Lenore nodded, unable to speak, around the lump in her throat. Rachel reached over and squeezed Colin's hand. "Tell her about the diagnosis," she said quietly. Colin took a breath. "The ALS started showing symptoms about a year ago. Just small things at first. Weakness in one hand, trouble with buttons. We thought it was carpal tunnel. By the time we got the real diagnosis, I was—" He paused. "I was angry. Not about being sick, though that wasn't great. Angry that I might die without ever knowing what happened to you. Without telling you I forgave you." "That's when he started searching," Rachel added. "Obsessively. Every record he could find. Every trail report. Every ranger station. He was determined to find you, or at least leave a message you might see. I left letters everywhere," Colin said. "Must have been 30 of them, all saying the same thing. I forgive you. Come home." Lenore pulled his letter from her pocket, now creased and worn from being carried. "The forest made sure I found one. I think—" She hesitated, then committed. "I think it knew. Somehow. It knew you were looking for me. Knew you were running out of time. So it showed me everything. Made me face the past so I could have a future. However short." "How short?" The question came out raw. "The letter said you didn't have much time. How much time?" Colin glanced at Rachel, then back to his mother. "The doctors say 18 months, maybe 2 years. The disease is progressing slowly, which is good. I've still got mobility, can still work part-time. But eventually—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 18 months, maybe 2 years. After 20 years apart, that was all they'd get. But it was more than she'd thought she'd have an hour ago. More than she deserved. "Then we don't waste it," Lenore said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever time we have, we don't waste a second." Colin smiled, and for a moment she saw the 8-year-old boy he'd been, grinning at her from behind a pine cone. "I was hoping you'd say that." Lenore remembered the seed in her pack. She retrieved it carefully and held it out to Colin. "The forest gave me this. When the final growth opened, when it showed me everything, it gave me this seed. I think we're supposed to plant it. Together." Colin took the seed, turning it over in his hands. It still glowed faintly, warm to the touch. "It's beautiful. What kind of tree will it grow into?" "I don't know," Lenore admitted. "Something new, maybe. Something that didn't exist before. A second chance, growing from impossible soil." "Like us," Rachel said softly. "Like us," Lenore agreed. They went outside, the 3 of them and Brigg, and Colin chose a spot in the front yard beneath the maple tree. Together, Lenore and Colin dug a hole and placed the seed in the earth. As they covered it with soil, Lenore felt something shift, like a weight she'd been carrying for 20 years finally lifting. The seed began to glow brighter, its light visible even through the soil. Then, impossibly, it sprouted. A green shoot emerged, growing fast enough to see it move, reaching toward the afternoon sun. Within minutes, it was a sapling. Within an hour, a young tree. its leaves unlike anything Lenore had ever seen, part pine, part deciduous, something entirely new. "It's perfect," Colin said, his hand finding hers. And standing there in the fading light, watching an impossible tree grow from a seed given by a forest that remembered, Lenore finally believed him. Maybe they would be perfect too. Maybe forgiveness could be that simple, that transformative. Maybe coming home wasn't about earning it, but about accepting it. Maybe she could finally let herself be loved. 3 months passed like water through cupped hands, precious and impossible to hold on to, but beautiful for their fluidity. Lenore moved into the guest room of Colin and Rachel's house, a small space that felt enormous after her cabin. She kept it sparse, uncomfortable with too much comfort, but gradually added personal touches. Her field journal on the desk, a photo of Brigg sleeping in a patch of sunlight, and the original photograph, now framed, of her and young Colin in the mountains. She found work at a local conservation centre, volunteering at first, then part-time employment cataloguing native plant species. It felt strange to be around people again, to make small talk and remember social protocols she'd forgotten. But it felt good too, like unused muscles stretching back to life. Colin's disease progressed slowly, as the doctors had predicted. He needed a cane now for longer walks, and his hand coordination was declining. But his mind stayed sharp, and his spirit stayed higher than Lenore would have thought possible for someone facing such a diagnosis. "I'm not happy about dying," he told her one evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the impossible tree. It had grown to 12 feet tall now, its branches spreading in patterns that seemed to shift depending on the angle of viewing. "But I'm happy I got to know you again. That makes it bearable." They talked about everything, the 20 years they'd missed. Colin's childhood after she'd left, the therapy, the questions, the gradual acceptance, his college years studying environmental science, following in her footsteps even when he didn't fully understand why. Meeting Rachel, building a life. And Lenore talked about her years in the wilderness, the loneliness, the survival, the slow erosion of guilt into something more like resignation. She showed him her field journals, all the observations she'd made, the wildlife she'd documented. "You never stopped being a scientist," Colin observed. "Even hiding from the world, you couldn't stop studying it." "It was all I knew how to do," she admitted. "The only way I knew to be in the world." "Is it different now?" She considered. "Yes. Before, I studied the world to understand it. Now She paused, searching for words. "Now I try to just be in it. With it. Part of it." The impossible tree became a minor sensation in the neighborhood. People would walk by just to see it, to puzzle over its strange beauty. Scientists from the university came to study it, took samples, left baffled. The cellular structure defied classification. It was as if someone had taken a dozen different species and woven them into something entirely new, which Lenore supposed was exactly what had happened. Rachel was 8 weeks pregnant when they found out. Colin cried when she told them, and Lenore held both of them while they processed the bittersweet reality. Colin would meet his child, but might not see them grow up. "Then we make sure they know their father," Lenore said fiercely. "We take videos, write letters, create something they can hold on to. And I'll tell them stories about you. Every single story I have, and the ones I missed, Rachel can fill in. This child will know exactly who their father was." Colin looked at her with something like awe. "You're going to be a grandmother." The word felt impossible. But then, so had Mother, 20 years ago when she'd walked away. And here she was, learning how to be one again, learning how to stay, I'm going to be terrible at it, she warned. I'll probably try to teach them plant biology when they're 2. Perfect, Colin said, grinning. They'll be the smartest 2-year-old in Montana. As spring arrived, Lenore made a trip back to the mountains. Colin couldn't make the journey anymore, but Rachel came, and Brigg, of course. They hiked to the massive ponderosa pine where the final growth had been. The growth was gone. The tree showed no sign it had ever been there, just healthy bark and the normal patterns of age and weather. But at the tree's base, Lenore found something. A ring of new growth. Saplings, dozens of them, each showing that same impossible hybrid structure as the tree in Colin's yard. It's spreading, Rachel breathed. The forest is growing something new. Lenore knelt among the saplings, running her hands over their strange bark. She understood now. The forest hadn't just been holding memories, preserving trauma. It had been learning, changing, growing into something that could bridge the gap between what was and what could be. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment Lenore could have sworn she heard a response. Not words exactly, but a sense of acknowledgement, of blessing, the forest releasing her from her penance, satisfied that the lesson had been learned. They camped that night at the same spot where she and Colin had camped 20 years before. Lenore told Rachel stories about that trip, the good parts she'd forgotten in her focus on the tragedy. Colin's excitement at seeing a deer, his terrible camp songs, the way he'd insisted on carrying the heaviest pack he could manage because he wanted to be helpful. He was a good kid, she said. He's a good man. I didn't ruin him, even though I tried my best to. You gave him resilience, Rachel said, the ability to forgive, to keep hoping even when it seemed pointless. Those are gifts, too. When they returned to Missoula, Colin was waiting on the porch, weaker but smiling. Lenore sat beside him and took his hand. The forest says hello, she told him, and it's growing new things, impossible things, things that shouldn't exist but do anyway. Like us, Colin said. Like us, she agreed. The impossible tree swayed in the breeze, its leaves catching the afternoon light in ways that seemed almost deliberate. A reminder that some wounds could heal, some losses could transform into growth, some mistakes, given enough time and forgiveness, could become the foundation for something beautiful and new. Lenore leaned her head on her son's shoulder and watched the tree that grew from forgiveness, thinking about the grandchild she'd meet in 6 months, the time she'd spend with Colin before the disease took him, the life she'd rebuilt from ruins. She'd spent 20 years learning to survive. Now she was learning something harder and more precious. How to live, how to love, how to accept that she was worthy of both. The forest had taught her well, and she would carry those lessons of memory and growth, of holding on to what matters and releasing what doesn't, of the possibility of impossible things forward into whatever came next. Some mistakes follow you no matter how far you run, but some mistakes, given time and grace and the wisdom of ancient forests, can teach you how to finally come home. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything